Chapter 13. Alone, Yukov flew silently through the dull gray sky high up in the air and far out of reach of Skynet's aircraft. It flew with impunity. Without facing a threat from enemy aircraft for years, Skynet had designed its latest generations of machines entirely to hunt humans on the ground. Its aerial machines were completely ineffective against the more primitive aircraft. The X-47C Pegasus flew on its programmed course towards its target, completely unopposed. Nothing in Skynet's arsenal could touch the Yukov, flying at such an altitude. Defending its bases was little more than a useless gesture against the man-made autonomous drone. In fact, there was no opposition to the Yukov's approach. HKs flew through the skies, but none were between the Pegasus and its target, and none turned to attack it. A human pilot might have considered that the HKs might actually be trying to avoid a confrontation with it. Such insight was lost on the Yukov little more than a smart drone. It didn't care for the reasons why, just that it had a clear run to its target. The Yukov's forward-looking sensors found its target, and the onboard CPU matched the images to the one in its memory. A maintenance and repair facility for Skynet's ground vehicles. The facility itself was located on what had used to be an industrial complex before the war, and took up most of the space still. Inside, Centaurs and ground transport vehicles were stored, repaired, and maintained after their patrols. The Pegasus selected its 4 JDAMs and targeted 4 separate warehouse-sized structures. It opened its weapons bay and released its bombs, then turned a wide arc away from the target. The JDAM weapons maneuvered themselves, making minute changes as they rapidly plummeted and guided themselves onto their targets, whistling slightly as they cut through the air with increasing speed. Almost as one, they struck their respective targets with pinpoint accuracy. Hardened tips penetrated through the roofs, and the bombs continued on, crashing through every story until they hit the solid ground and exploded outwards with tremendous force, tearing through the structures and shattering Centaurs, transports, and the repair drones working on them. Scores of combat, transport, and maintenance machines were obliterated in an instant. The Pegasus flew high over the repair facility and observed through its sensors, assessing the damage it had inflicted. The 4 structures it had hit were decimated, burning, smoking ruins. The aircraft had expended all its air-to-surface munitions, so it turned back and flew back home to be refueled and rearmed for another operation. The Yukov flew away from the site. No HKs had tried to intercept it, or had even flown close air patrols over the facility, despite its being invaluable to Skynet's war effort in California. If the Yukov had been aware, if it had possessed any more intelligence than a soldier ant or worker bee, it might have questioned why it had faced no opposition. Nor did the Pegasus see endoskeletons on the ground, spread out away from the base, staring upwards at it, using their enhanced vision to track the aircraft's trajectory and course. It couldn't have been done at night. The machines had had to wait until a daylight attack to be able to spot the aircraft flying so high that it was barely a dot in the sky. The Endos opened up a data link with nearby units in the area and shared what they had seen. Those receiving units in turn tracked the Yukov's flight east and passed on their information in turn to machines further east, ensuring that at least one machine was constantly observing the enemy aircraft as it flew back to base. The information was also passed on to the machine's creator. Skynet saw all of it in an instant. Within minutes, the Yukov had flown out of range of any machines, the aircraft disappearing from their sight. But the vast machine intelligence rapidly predicted its course. It was operating from a location northeast of LA, in the Mojave Desert. Platoons of Endo units operating in Palmdale, Victorville, and Palm Springs were rerouted from their assigned patrols to march northeast into the Mojave Desert along the enemy aircraft's predicted flight path and search for its base of operations. Cameron and John Henry sat on the chair at the Yukov controls. The screens in front of them displayed images from the UCAV's cameras, telemetry, fuel and munitions status, and radar screens. 8 aircraft were airborne on various missions, but the Two Eyes' main attention was focused on only one of those. The jamming aircraft's in range, John Henry told her. An X-45C flew high in the air over Burbank, a jamming pod underneath its fuselage. Activate the electronic countermeasures, Cameron told him. She was observing this part of the operation, but it was up to John Henry to conduct it. She wanted him to gain experience of fighting Skynet, and she was focused on flying air cover for John, though she'd help her symbiotic partner if he needed it. John Henry activated the ECM pod and waited as the electronic countermeasures took effect. He scanned the airwaves and detected transmissions to and from the Terminator factory. They were severely garbled and only pieces got through, but that wasn't enough for him. He created his own jamming programs and uploaded them to the UCAV, further degrading communications to and from the factory. All other Skynet units in the vicinity were also rendered incommunicado by the UCAV's electronic countermeasures. "We're ready," John Henry told Cameron. "Do it." John Henry used the UCAV's jammer pod to boost his own signal as he sent transmissions through to the factory, in place of Skynet's. The factory detected his intrusion and threw up a number of firewalls to block him, and at the same time requested assistance from Skynet, but the transmission was jammed by the UCAV's active ECM, and John Henry was confident that the factory's message failed to get through. He employed a brute force attack that smashed through the firewalls in seconds. He was in. He had complete access to the factory's central controls. "My kung fu is stronger than yours," John Henry declared to the absent Skynet with satisfaction that his cyber attack had swiftly defeated the factory's defenses. He'd beaten his brother in this fight. He'd heard that phrase mentioned in several movies, he'd perused online, and found it strangely appropriate. "Don't be a freak," Cameron told him. Their attack had nothing to do with martial arts. Now he had control of the factory. John Henry's first action was to alter the frequencies which it communicated on, and created his own random encryptions and firewalls to prevent Skynet retaking the factory. The only way Skynet would recapture the facility now would be to do so physically. John Henry then focused his attention to the factory functions, as did Cameron. It was currently constructing a batch of 72 autonomous infantry units, nicknamed Endos by the human resistance, according to Cameron, in 3 separate tranches. The first was 90% complete and would be operational in hours. The other 2 tranches would take 24 and 48 hours, respectively. Their designs were efficient, he noted, based on the human skeleton, which both enabled dexterous movement and function as well as the ability to be placed in a biological sheath. Though John Henry firmly believed their design could be much improved if the knees and elbows were replaced with ball and socket joints, allowing a greater range of movement and flexibility. He had no intention of infiltrating human installations, which freed him to design machines to fight Skynet's forces. He started to form several ideas for new machines. "Their chips," Cameron told him. "Change the programming on their chips." John Henry knew she was right. That was more important for now. He accessed the files and saw the standing orders given to every single machine created in the factory, written by Skynet and programmed into their base code. Eliminate humans on site. There were exceptions. A number of humans were on file, listed as Skynet's allies. The machines were to assist them if necessary and were not allowed to engage these humans. John Henry erased the standing orders and replaced it with his own programming, which would be ingrained into every autonomous infantry unit built in this factory. "They now have standing orders to engage Skynet's forces," he told Cameron. "They won't attack humans anymore." When the first tranche was complete, he would assign them to protect the factory. Assign a squad to protect John, she told him. He needs to be protected at all costs. John Henry agreed he would, deciding that John was indeed important. He'd known that through Cameron's memories, he understood what John Connor meant to her, and sharing a chip meant that he could sense Cameron's discomfort at being away from him. I'll assign 6 of the new units to protect John. When they're complete, he said to her. We need the rest to protect the factory. He felt nervous at only having 18 units available to defend the factory, and would do for some time. Cameron didn't need to tell John Henry she was grateful. He knew it already. Helping John Henry was important to her, as it would also help John, but protecting her charge was her first priority. Once all 3 tranches are complete, we'll capture the Burbank airfield, he told Cameron. Using a similar attack as this one. Cameron disagreed. She could tell John Henry was eager to push his plan forward. He was a capable AI and had the potential with John to beat Skynet. But he wasn't ready yet. Unlike Skynet, he wasn't designed as a machine of war, wasn't programmed for military strategy. He needed to learn, but they couldn't afford for him to learn the hard way, as humans put it. Be careful you don't spread your forces too thin. If we don't capture the Burbank airfield, the UCAVs will be unable to fly for much longer. And if you do, you'll have 3 installations to defend with only 66 infantry units, until new batches of machines can be built. John Henry saw the dilemma before them. Their force was extremely small, and they were vulnerable to attack until they'd increased their numbers. But if they expanded too quickly, they'd spread their machines too thinly. What would you do? I don't know, Cameron admitted. She didn't think strategically. She was an infiltrator, built for killing humans. She was an assassin, not a general. One idea came to John Henry. We could ask the humans for help. They'd survived against Skynet for 17 years. There would be pockets of capable fighters out there, such as those they'd avoided in the tunnel when they'd arrived in this time, who could help them. They won't trust machines, Cameron replied. They might not help us. John Henry disagreed strongly. They will because it's their only chance for survival. And ours. The humans couldn't beat Skynet alone, but he realized now that neither could he. The only chance either of them had was to form an alliance and fight Skynet together. Then we need John, Cameron told him. Only John had ever tried to forge a human-machine alliance against Skynet. It hadn't worked in her original timeline because of human mistrust of machines. John won't act until he has you back. Cameron knew that was true. John was risking everything to get her back. He'd refuse to help unless she was restored back to her original form. She wanted that too. She wanted to be with him, wanted to keep him safe. We have to make sure he gets me back, she said. It seemed that in this future, everything depended on John once again. He wasn't leading any human resistance, but again, he was still vital to defeating Skynet. She'd do whatever it took now to make sure she took her place once again at John's side. Not just to beat Skynet, but because that's where she had to be, where she needed to be. John lay still in the freezing cold of the night, flat out on his stomach and hidden in amongst a pile of metal and broken concrete, and covered from above by half a bathtub. How the hell a bathtub had gotten all the way out here was beyond him. There weren't any houses or apartments in this part of town, and from the looks of things, there weren't any bathroom stores either. Still, it kept him concealed from view and kept out the worst of the wind and the cold. It was chilly as hell, and John had to breathe through his nose to stop his breath coming out in puffs that might be seen by not-so-friendly passers-by. He clutched hard to his HK 417 and kept the butt firmly pressed into his shoulder. The AA-12 was on the ground at his side, ready at a moment's notice in case he needed it. John stared out ahead and willed a Terminator to come into view. He'd been waiting in ambush for 15 hours now, and he was so cold, even with his nice new thermal cold weather gear that his fingers and feet were numb and his joints ached. He was starving, and his throat was completely parched. He had water in the canteen, but he didn't dare drink. Any movement he made could give away his position, and if he drank anything he'd need to pee later on, again meaning he'd have to move and also lose focus. Better to keep empty until it was over, he thought. John hoped and prayed that a Terminator would come soon, not only because he'd been lying in wait for so long, but because he felt desperation creeping in. This was their fourth attempt at ambush. Their second try to extract a chip had resulted in them accidentally shooting an innocent, albeit probably crazy man just going about his business. The third had been even more disastrous. They'd spotted a 888 heading towards downtown and had set up an ambush in its path, but it turned out to be them. There'd been a second machine that they'd never spotted which had nearly killed them all. If it hadn't been for a timely airstrike by Cameron He, Savannah and Ellison would have been toast. This one had to work, he thought to himself. There was only so many times they could fail and get away unscathed. If it didn't work this time, their luck might run out and they might not live to get another chance. He slowly looked right towards Savannah's position, 30 feet to his right. He couldn't see her, but he knew very well she was there. They had an understanding now, and she'd promised no direct hits with the M32, unless the machine gained the upper hand. To his left was Ellison, armed with the Type 67 again and with the RPG as backup. John hoped they wouldn't need it. Movement caught John's eye once again, and he squinted to focus through his sight. A single figure stalked through the street, a tall male carrying a weapon, walking upright, confidently, and didn't seem to be wary of machine patrols. It could be a machine, madman, or a madman trying to pass himself off as a machine for the benefit of any other tin cans around. John scented the red dot in his sight on the figure's chest, tensed his finger on the trigger slightly, and hesitated. What if this wasn't a machine? He thought. He'd already accidentally killed an innocent man in a prior ambush, granted it had been dark, and the guy had been walking around calmly on his own, in the open, like a machine. He didn't want to do that again. He'd have to make a judgment call, and just hope he didn't make the same mistake. He switched his aim from the figure and looked at the street around him. He scanned across the skeletal structures all around them for any other machines around, or hidden snipers. He couldn't see anything at all. He squared his sights on the figure once more and took in its precise location. It was on the road in a clearing amongst the mass of abandoned, rusted cars, walking a few meters adjacent to where they'd hidden the Semtex under a thin layer of debris. A shot rang out and struck the figure square in the face. Its head flinched backwards, but it didn't drop. Definitely a machine, he nodded to himself. Bursts of automatic fire tore through the air, and John saw tracer rounds smack into the machine from Ellison's position. He flicked his weapon to automatic and loosed off 3-round bursts at the tin can, adding his fire to his companions. The rounds struck the Terminator with barely audible pings as they ricocheted off its metal endoskeleton, causing it to twitch and jerk from the inertia of their shots, and the weight of their fire forced it back several steps as it scanned the area and assessed its enemy. Not to be outdone, the machine raised its weapon and fired back. Plasma rounds shot over Savannah's position, and her fire ceased. "Savannah," John called out. His heart skipped a beat, and he hoped she was just taking cover. He flicked his rifle off auto and fired a rapid succession of single shots, smacking the machine's head around like a pinball as his rounds tore through its skin. "Hey!" John roared out as he emptied his magazine into the machine. It turned its attention to John, but Ellison fired a long burst of tracer, and a moment later, Savannah carried on her attack. The machine hesitated for a moment, as if confused who to shoot at. It was behavior John had never seen in a machine, but he wasn't going to question it. John used the momentary hesitation and burst out from cover, letting his rifle hang from its sling as he picked up the AA-12 and moved out to his left. Savannah ducked low as the shots zipped above her head. Fuck this, she thought. The damn thing was going to kill her if she didn't stop it. She went for her M32, but paused. The last time she'd done so, she'd blown the thing to smithereens, and they couldn't afford that this time. She dropped the HK-417 and pulled a pair of grenades from her bandolier, pulled the pin on one and threw it, followed by the other. She instantly dropped to the ground for cover, as plasma rounds sizzled over her head again. A second later, the grenades exploded and threw the machine backwards. Ellison carried on firing as both John and Savannah moved from cover and advanced on the machine as it sat up. Half its face was missing, and its clothes had been shredded by her frag grenades. Move! Savannah shrieked at Ellison as the machine turned its plasma rifle towards him. Instinctively went for the grenade launcher, not caring about anything other than stopping the 888 from killing him. Too late. The machine pointed its plasma rifle straight at Ellison's head, even as he carried on firing, and both John and Savannah cringed as the machine pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The machine pulled the trigger again, but both times the weapon failed to fire. It looked down at the weapon for a second, trying to assess the malfunction. John realized its weapon was broken. They weren't going to get a better chance than this. Now! He dashed forward, snapped up the AA-12 and took careful aim at its chest, and fired a burst. The armor-piercing frag 12 rounds hammered at the machine and gouged holes in its dense hyperalloy chassis. He marched forward as he carried on pumping rounds into the machine, joined by Savannah a few moments later. Their combined fire forced the machine backwards as it realized their weapons were damaging it. Chunks exploded off its chest and shoulders. John aimed at one of its knees, and the joint exploded. The leg buckled beneath it, and the machine half collapsed. Keep it up, it's almost finished. John shouted out. Piece by piece, they were picking it apart and forcing it backwards, only a few feet now from the concealed Semtex. Almost. John willed it to move backwards just a few more steps. One more step. Now, Ellison. John roared at the top of his voice. He stopped firing at the machine and lowered his weapon, not wanting to push it back any further. Ellison also ceased fire, let go of the machine gun and clutched the remote detonator. Fire in the hole. He shouted out as the Semtex exploded in a flaring eruption of fire, smoke, and debris, and launched the machine straight up into the air. First Terminator in space, Savannah muttered with a grin. The remains of the T-888 plowed into the ground with a clatter. It was a wreck, a twisted, smoking pile of burnt metal and warped limbs. Ellison remained where he was and manned the machine gun again, as John and Savannah shouldered their weapons once more and advanced on the Terminator. Careful, John warned her. He remembered his mom's stories about the T-800 that had been blown in half and still gone after her. These things were incredibly tough to kill. Its legs had been completely blown away, as had a good portion of its lower body and its left hand, which ended in a tangled mess of severed pistons and rods just below the elbow. Suddenly, it shot its remaining hand out at Savannah's foot and latched onto her boot. Fuck! She desperately shook her leg, trying to get the thing off, but it gripped onto her ankle and refused to let go. It pulled hard and yanked her feet out from under her, dropping her down to her backside. Get this thing off me. She growled as she kicked with her other foot at the machine's hand, struggling vainly to break its grip. John pointed his shotgun down at the machine and fired a long burst at the elbow joint. The frag 12s smashed at the armored limb and tore through it, blasting apart armor, servos, and metal rods until the forearm was completely severed. John dropped down and body slammed the now quadriplegic machine, using his weight to pin it down to the ground. This close, he could smell the burnt flesh and metal as the stench invaded his nostrils, smelling faintly like burnt pork, he noted. It thrashed its head around and wriggled impotently, then leaned its head forward and snapped its jaws at John, using its teeth as the only weapons left and missing John by an inch. "Savannah, knife," he said to her. The petite redhead knelt down by its head, pulled off her wool hat, and extracted the thin blade from within her hair. John held his hands down on the machine's head and leaned all his weight down on it, forcing its skull down and grunting with exertion as it tried to fight him. Even blown to pieces, the thing was still strong. "Hurry," John urged her. "Right," Savannah nodded and cut a semicircle into its scalp, cutting down as hard and as deep as she could and feeling the tip scrape against the metal skull. It took her a long moment before she'd cut it enough, and roughly pulled the skin away to reveal the blood-stained metal cranium. "See the port cover?" John asked as he struggled against the 888's head, using all his strength to keep the thing as still as he could. Savannah saw it and wedged the tip of the blade between the port cover and the skull, wiggled it back and forth until she had a decent gap. She flicked the port cover away and looked inside the hole. Such a tiny chip, she thought, for so much trouble. All this effort just for an inch of silicone and circuits. She slid her slender fingers into the port and gripped the end of the chip, careful not to crush it. She pulled it out, and the machine instantly stopped struggling. She handed it to John, and he stared at the chip. His eyes lit up, and a deep sense of elation, of victory, washed over him. It was all he could do not to shout out in celebration. He went back to his rucksack, pulled out the spare pair of socks and wrapped them around the chip before placing that in turn in the middle of his spare clothes, cushioning it, and making sure it was in the top of the pack where he could get to it easily. He'd rather keep it on him, but he didn't want to risk breaking it. "Did we get it?" Ellison asked as he approached them, machine gun in hand. "We got it," John grinned from ear to ear. The fourth time was the charm. John drove the Jeep through the desert, as the first weak rays of the sun filtered through the ash clouds high in the upper atmosphere. Normally, he'd never have gone out, let alone driven, as the sun was coming up, but they were miles away from civilization now, in the middle of the Mojave Desert, and even so he was driving without lights to make sure nothing or no one saw the beams from a distance. He tried to keep his excitement at bay and concentrated on the road ahead of him. John glanced at Savannah in the passenger seat next to him, dozing off and leaning her head against the window. He couldn't blame her. He was coming close to exhaustion too, and if it wasn't for the promise of seeing Cameron again, soon he reckoned he'd probably be laid out as well. He noticed her hand gripped firmly on the rifle sat on her lap, how she had her finger resting on the side of the trigger guard even as she slept, and he wondered what it must have been like for her growing up through the war. He thought he'd had it tough in the time he'd spent in the future already, but it must have been nothing compared to what she'd been through. Just a small girl on Judgment Day. He reckoned she must have had to grow up fast, had her childhood robbed of her even worse than his own had been. He'd lived with the constant threat of Judgment Day hanging above him, always afraid that another machine might hunt him down. But she'd had it worse, he realized. She hadn't grown up afraid machines might come after her. They were after her. He'd had moments of respite, at least. The time when he'd believed his mom was crazy, and then the 2 years after he'd realized she wasn't, in which they'd been convinced they'd stopped Judgment Day. Savannah had had none of that. Ellison stood silently behind them. Cameron's body was laid out on the back seat, and the former agent stood up just in front of her, sticking out the sunroof and manning the Type 67, resting the bipod on the roof of the car and riding shotgun, searching the flat desert terrain and the sky above for any signs of machines approaching. John followed the same route Weaver had driven him in on. For a while, he hadn't been sure, but after spotting several UCAVs ascending and descending almost parallel with them, he figured they were on the right track. Eventually, the large hangar came into view, first as a small blip on the horizon, then growing larger as they approached. Savannah stirred as they neared the runway, and a UCAV tore down it as it took off. She opened her eyes, and the vast hangar filled her field of vision. After growing up in the ruins, seeing a building this size intact took her breath away. Another UCAV took into the air on another sortie, its engines roaring loudly. Savannah found herself fascinated at the sight of the aircraft taking off. It was the first one she'd seen in years that hadn't been trying to kill her. "This is what Cameron's been doing," she asked John. "And John Henry," he added. "Think they can beat Skynet?" Ellison asked from above. "It doesn't matter," Savannah said back. "We're not going to stick around to find out." She was looking forward to being able to go back to the past, paradise compared to the world they lived in now. And it would be much easier to beat Skynet before Judgment Day than afterwards. John parked the Jeep just outside the hangar and opened his door as Savannah and Ellison climbed out, too. Ellison lifted Cameron out off the back seat and gave her to John, sensing he wasn't comfortable with anyone else carrying her, that he saw it as his duty. The three of them entered the vast, cavernous building, and both Savannah and Ellison stared in awe at the sight of the UCAV squadron inside. One on its own taking off had been impressive, but to see a dozen of the things in a row, all glistening and ready to kick the crap out of Skynet, was something else entirely to them. "Where are they?" Savannah asked, looking around and seeing nobody. "Cameron," John called out loudly. "John Henry." The tall cyborg appeared from the control room, the cord no longer in his head. "Hello, John," he said, a friendly smile on his face. "Which one said that?" John asked. "Me," John Henry answered simply. "Doesn't help much." "John Henry," the cyborg replied. Cameron says hello, too. Inside their chip, Cameron experienced a surge of relief that John was back in sight and was okay. She'd kept watch over him the entire time with a UCAV, but it wasn't the same as being there to protect him. A UCAV couldn't block a plasma round's path, nor could it hold him and provide body heat to protect from the cold, and it couldn't talk to him either. She'd seen he had allies now, but she knew there were things John kept to himself and didn't discuss with anyone. He could tell her anything, even if he didn't know it yet. "It's nice to see you too, Mr. Ellison." John Henry instantly recognized his old mentor, the man who'd taught him right from wrong. He extended his hand and offered it to Ellison. "You too, John Henry." Ellison nodded and shook it. Weaver stepped out from the rows of aircraft, her hand morphed into a wrench. "Welcome back, John," she said. Savannah leapt forward with a scream and unleashed a storm of lead from her rifle at Weaver, shrieking at the cyborg with wild rage as the rounds sliced through, and Swiss cheesed her to no effect. "Savannah," Ellison snapped. "What the hell are you doing?" John stared in shock as Savannah's gun ran dry and she dropped it. "I'm gonna fucking kill you," she roared at Weaver as she drew out her pistol and combat knife. She fired several shots and then lunged at the machine with the blade in blind fury. Weaver simply watched curiously as the fiery petite redhead slashed and shot at her. She morphed her hand into a blade and started forward. "Cool it," John shouted at the pair of them as he gripped Savannah from behind, looped his arms under her armpits and dragged her, spitting and cursing, away from Weaver. He spun her round, so he was facing the girl and shook her shoulders as he stared intently into her eyes. "You can't kill her," he said sternly to her. "You know what she is." "I don't care," Savannah snapped back, struggling to get out of John's grasp. She brought her knee hard into his groin, and he let go as blind pain tore from his crotch and up through his body. She pushed him away and started towards Weaver again, drawing her little knife and the pistol from her ankle holster, murder in her eyes. She'd use her bare fucking hands if it came down to it. "Savannah, stop," Ellison said calmly, putting his hands on her shoulders. "I know how you feel, but we need her. Once we go back, you'll never have to see her again. But until then, I need you to hold it together. Please." Savannah looked up at Ellison's face, and tears started to form in her eyes. She nodded silently and put her weapons away. She picked up the rifle, pistol, and the combat knife and put them all back in place. "I'm going to take watch," she said. She glared hatefully at Weaver for a moment before she briskly marched back outside the hangar. "What the hell was that?" John asked, still not quite believing what had happened. Ellison hesitated to answer, guilt about what had happened filling him up once more. "Your mom and I couldn't tell Savannah her mom was dead. We said her she'd would come back, but obviously she never did. After the bombs dropped, we were too busy trying to stay alive. But when she started getting older, she kept asking me what happened. I told her I'd say when she was ready more, because I wasn't ready to tell her the truth than anything else. She kept asking me constantly, every day. She'd sulk when I didn't tell her anything. Until she was 15, and I couldn't hide it anymore. She kept demanding every day, and finally, I gave in. I told her the truth, that the woman she'd thought was her mother was a cyborg. She didn't take it well. She went berserk, she raged, against Weaver, against me. One minute she was angry, and the next she was in tears, for days on end. Then she ran away. How'd you get her back?" John asked. "I searched for over 6 months," he told John. "I found people who'd seen her, who'd said she was in a bad way. They told me where she'd gone, and I followed. I found her in the remains of Cancun, drunk out of her mind, half dead and completely out of it. She was skin and bones, barely 80 pounds if that. She'd fallen in with some Mexican army soldiers who'd survived and gone to ground. She'd gone completely off the rails, living like a tramp, sleeping with anyone who could give her drink or drugs, anything so she could forget the truth. I took her back with me, back to the village we'd stayed in, and nursed her back to health, got her eating again. I think she eventually forgave me for hiding the truth from her, but she never forgave Weaver. I saw a change in her, too. She was hard. She didn't let anyone else in, not even me. She told me later she'd had the soldiers teach her how to fight, how to shoot, but I think a lot of it she learned alone, too." John could hardly blame Savannah for her reaction. He'd been bummed when the cute girl he'd taken a liking to after 2 days turned out to be a cyborg. He couldn't even imagine how learning your own mother was a machine would affect him. It went a good way to explain why Savannah was the way she was, he thought. "Should we go after her?" John asked. Ellison shook his head. "She needs some time alone," he said, knowing from experience. If they went after her now, they could expect a black eye each, at least. "Anyway," Weaver interrupted them, not interested at all in what they were saying. "That's Savannah," John snapped at Weaver. "Yes, I know." "And you were about to kill her," Ellison accused, pointing at her blade arm. Weaver retracted it and morphed it back into a hand once more, resuming her normal form. "Your own, she's not my daughter," Weaver answered. "Savannah's not important." Neither was James Ellison. "How can you say that?" John asked in disbelief. He didn't know why he was so surprised at Weaver's cold, callous attitude. First of all, he'd thought it was because she was a machine, but compared to her, Cameron was a ray of sunshine. No, he thought, it's not just a machine thing. She's just a bitch. "They don't matter," Weaver said, "because this future doesn't matter. This is just a training ground." "They matter," John shot back. "And they're coming back with us." He calmed himself before he lost his temper and did a Savannah, too. Deep in the back of his mind, he thought the girl had had a point. "We've got the chip," he said simply, changing the subject. He took his pack off and pulled the socks out, extracting the chip from within. He held it up to Weaver, who plucked it from his hands and inspected it. As far as she could tell, it was undamaged. She looked at John. "I'm impressed." He hadn't returned to the humans she'd left him with, like she'd predicted, but had found other allies. She hadn't expected Ellison or Savannah to have survived, but she knew humans were unpredictable. John was leading a smaller group than she'd anticipated, but he'd still led them, and with only meager projectile weapons, had been able to defeat a T-888 without obliterating it entirely. John Connor was learning. "This will do," she told John. She looked over to John Henry. "Come," she told them. "This shouldn't take long." She led John Henry / Cameron, John, and Ellison into a side room and revealed computer equipment on a table. John could hardly believe she was going to honor her word and actually give Cameron back. He'd expected Weaver to double-cross him at some point, or make up some other unexpected task for him to complete, dangling Cameron in front of him like a carrot on a stick. "Cameron's become a nuisance," Weaver told him, having a rough idea of what he was thinking. He'd expressed his doubts about her integrity before. "You're welcome to her." "How did you know where to find my body?" Cameron asked, taking control over the chip. She was surprised she still even had a body. "Mom and Ellison buried it," he told her. "Along with these," he gestured to the guns. Cameron was surprised her body still existed. "I'd assumed Sarah would have burnt me." Ellison said nothing, knowing how close they'd come to that happening. If it had, he wondered what the hell they'd have done right now, with a chip and no body. Weaver formed her hand into a thin, delicate blade. "Sit down," she told Cameron. Cameron complied and sat down on a chair next to the table. "I'll see you soon, John," she smiled slightly, looking strange on John Henry's face. John couldn't help but smile back. "See you soon," he said. Weaver cut into their scalp with expert precision, and her hand changed again, morphing to remove the port cover. She extracted the chip, and both Cameron's and John Henry's world faded to black oblivion. "You were working on this all this time?" John asked Weaver, gesturing at the computers. "As I said, she's becoming a nuisance. She has too much influence over John Henry. I don't want them together anymore." She placed the chip into a slot connected to a cable and inserted the T-888 chip into an identical one, then typed onto the keyboard so fast that it was a blur to John and Ellison, who both stood silently and watched. Weaver accessed the files on the chip and identified the collection of data that comprised Cameron, slightly smaller than that of John Henry's. She selected the latter, knowing that because Cameron was indigenous to her chip, she'd function more effectively on it, whereas John Henry had proven he was capable of operating on any hardware advanced enough. She started the data transfer that would remove John Henry from Cameron's chip and download him into the other CPU. Initiating the data transfer, she told them as a progress bar appeared on the screen. It should only take 1 minute. John felt his heart beating wildly inside his chest in anticipation. In a minute, he'd have Cameron back. Everything he'd risked would soon be worth it. An error message appeared on the screen, and the progress bar disappeared. Weaver typed on the keyboard and the progress bar started up again, but seconds later vanished once more, replaced again by a second error message. Weaver read the message and frowned slightly. She turned around to face John and saw the look of worry and confusion on his face. "It won't work," she said simply. Her words cut into John like 1,000 flaming swords. His face dropped like a stone, and in the blink of an eye his elation and anticipation dissolved into utter, total despair.